So today we are thrilled to have Professor Kevin Leyton-Brown as the first speaker of this webinar series. Professor Leyton-Brown is a professor of computer science at University of British Columbia and holds Canada CIFAR AI chair at the Alberta Machine Intelligence Institute. He is also an associate member of the Vancouver School of Economics. He received PhD and MSc from Stanford. He studies AI mostly at intersection of machine learning and design and operation of electronic markets and design of heuristic algorithms. Professor Leyton-Brown has co-authored 2 books, Multi-Agent Systems and Essentials of Game Theory, and over 100 peer-reviewed technical articles. His work has received over 16,000 citations, and he has the H index of 49. He is a fellow of Advancement of Artificial Intelligence, also known as AAAI. He and his team won the 2018 Informs France Ultimate Award of Achievement in Advanced Analytics, Operation Research, and Management Science, described as the leading OR and Analytics Award in industry. He also received UBC's 2015 Charles A. McDonwell Award, 2014 Stacy Memorial Fellowship, and 2013 Outstanding Young Researcher Prize from Canadian Association of Computer Science. Set Zilla at International SAT Solver competitions in 2003 and 2015. He and co-authors received many paper awards from JIR, ACM, Electronic Economic EC, and AAMAS, and 9. He is a former chair of the ACM Special Interest Group of Electronic Commerce. He has currently advising many companies. And now he is the co-founder of Kudo.ug and Meta Algorithmic Technology. Please join me to welcome Professor Leyton-Brown for his talk, Making an Impact, a Tale of 2 Projects. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And let me get my screen share going here. There we go. I hope you can see that. So yeah, as John was saying, I'd like to encourage you to feel free to have a conversation with me here. Thank you all for coming. It's great to be able to meet, my colleagues just in the same place. It's sad that it takes a pandemic for us to get together. I wish I could actually go to the other university in Vancouver, or for that matter, I wish I could go to my own university in Vancouver. But in the meantime, it's great to be joining you. I see a couple of you turning your videos on. Thank you for that. It's really nice to give a talk that feels like it's to humans. So by all means, if you're not shy, turn your video on and give me the impression that there are other people out there. And if you've got something to say, and if your video's on and you raise your hand, I'll see you. Raise your hand, I mean, use the Zoom feature called Raise Hand, then I'll see you. If you don't do that and instead you put something in the chat, then the organizers will maybe get involved and let me know that you've got something to say. But if this really goes sideways and we get too much interruption, we'll have to replan. But I think it'll be fun if we all have this as a conversation. So I encourage you to just dive in. So in that spirit, let me begin. So I'm going to speak about the idea of AI for social impact, AI for social good. What does this mean? What might we aspire to do? To what extent is it hype? To what extent is it something realistic that we really can have a positive social impact on the world? And what does that mean? And I'm going to speak about this through the mechanism of thinking about my own experiences as trying to work in this space a couple of different projects myself. I don't know, incidentally, if the technology exists to make that doorbell sound stop, but that would sure be nice. It's kind of just hard to focus. I'll leave it to you to see whether that could be changed once the meeting's already begun. All right, so I'm going to speak specifically about market design, which I expect is probably not the area of focus of most of the people who are here, because it's one of my key kind of methodological hammers that I bring to bear on AI problems. Let me note that markets are a great way of allocating scarce resources in settings where you have a bunch of different participants, different agents, who each have their own interests. And you want to make some kind of globally good decision, but information about how people feel about different outcomes is not available centrally. So you have to ask people to report about what their interests are, what their priorities are, and you have to be concerned about whether they're going to tell you the truth or whether they're going to behave strategically. And the reason you care about doing all of this is that you, as the designer of this whole system, care about bringing about good social outcomes. Often we think about efficiency as a social outcome. I'll talk also about some alternatives. So historically, market design has been an area of research within economics, but over the last sort of 20 years or so, it's increasingly become a concern in computer science in general and artificial intelligence in particular. And this is because markets have moved online and they're starting to have rich, complicated bidding languages that give rise to complicated computational problems for even deciding who wins in an auction or what decision a market should make. So normally you think about the process by which a market says who are the winners and who are the losers being a kind of obvious thing. It's like taking the max of a set of bids or something. But once you start having combinatorial spaces of bids where I might say, I'll bid this amount as long as I ask for all of these things at the same time, but not that, you start having combinatorial optimization problems at the root of these markets. So this really is an exciting and vibrant area in AI and data science that is, I guess, the lens that I bring to this problem. So I'm going to speak about two different projects that I've been part of, and let me say this is maybe going to be different from a lot of other talks that you might have seen, because my whole aim in speaking about both of these projects is really to reflect on both the successes and failures of these projects. So I'm going to be a little bit deliberately playing up the negative as well as the positive about I think the impacts that some of these projects had, their successes and their failures, because I really want to use my own work as a kind of lens through which we can think about what it's realistic to hope for in terms of AI impacting the world, and how we might be able to what it might look like to have a program to do this better. So the first project I want to tell you about is thinks about the problem of allocating donated food. It's joint with Taylor Lundy, Alex Wei, and Hu Fu, and Scott Commoners. Alex and Scott are both at Harvard Business School. So here's the setting. Large donations of food come into a centralized food bank, which is a sort of big warehouse that receives donations of food. And this centralized warehouse needs to redistribute the food to local subsidiaries that are called food pantries. And the way that it does this is that it asks these food pantries to report what their demand in their local community for donated food is. And all players in this system are charitable. It's not like they're going to turn around and sell this food to try to maximize profit. But it's nevertheless the case that the food pantries have a bit of an incentive to over-report, because these are service entities in their own local communities. They're particularly concerned about serving their own community, and they don't have a lot of visibility into what demand looks like in the rest of the country. And so they, all things being equal, have a bit of a tendency to over-report their demand because they want to be conservative and make sure that they don't run out of food. Now, if you think about how an economist would typically address the problem of trying to allocate something a bunch amongst a bunch of independent decision makers in order to be sort of socially efficient. And they would tell you that the right way to do it is through payments. You would want all of these different actors to tell you how much they would be willing to pay for the thing being allocated, and you would give it to the people who are willing to pay the most. And you can prove a beautiful theorem that says this is going to achieve the socially efficient outcome. But it's really not appropriate in this case because you don't want food pantries having to pay food banks for food. And furthermore, the food pantries with the least money might be the ones with the greatest need for food. So this really might be entirely inappropriate. So what can you do here instead? There's some other ways that this setting is a little bit atypical from a market design perspective. So the demand in this setting is stochastic. So agents know their probability of needing food on a given day. The central decision maker doesn't. Then the agents realize this demand after declaring their probability, and the center only knows the setting. So the food banks want the food to be used efficiently, and the food pantries are at least a bit strategic. So they, all things being equal, they would prefer to receive food that they need than to see that same food go to somebody else who also needs it. So they're not sort of actively trying to harm each other, but they're particularly concerned with the interests of their own communities. So we brought two theoretical ideas to bear here. The first was to think about this as a utility maximization problem rather than a social welfare maximization problem. So normally we try to maximize the sum of agents' values for the outcome disregarding payments. That's sort of the standard economics approach. Here instead, we talked about maximizing the sum of agents' values minus the payments that were collected. So we wanted to try to maximize the utility of the outcome rather than the efficiency of the outcome. That distinction might seem subtle, but actually there's not very much in the economics literature on this setting, partly because it's much harder to get positive results in this setting. The second idea, essentially because the first idea by itself is a problem rather than a solution, it makes the problem really hard, is to notice something that arises in this case of charities that isn't generally true, which is that in the case of charitable donations, there's usually a mechanism for auditing. So it's usually possible to say, if I'm going to give a donation to your organization, I have the right to kind of come back and say, did you make good use of the donation? Did you, fraudulently tell me that you needed something, or did you do the right thing with the donation? And in our model, we say that if you demand food and don't use it, you can be punished. And this makes sense because charities are already audited anyway. So, when we approach this problem, we looking through the market design lens, we look at this model and say, yep, looks like a market design problem. This is the kind of thing we can hit with our hammer. Great, we're off to the races. Let's see what we can do. We began by thinking about the simplest setting, as one often does in an economic problem, where agents either need a food allocation or they don't. So they don't get any utility for being allocated food and then not having to give it. And we model this in the simplest setting where there's just sort of a yes or no decision about whether to make an allocation. So there's just kind of one fixed quantity of food that a food pantry would be allocated. So the allocation problem is binary. It's just, do you get allocated in this round or do you not? And in this setting, we invented a new kind of economic mechanism that has some really nice properties. So we called them waste not, pay not mechanisms. And the way they work is if you get allocated, we audit you. And we only charge you money if you were allocated and didn't need the allocation. By the way, you might notice that I said that money is inappropriate in this setting, and now all of a sudden I'm talking about charging money. For the moment, think about this as a theoretical building block where we say, I imagine for the moment that we were allowed to use money, but we still have the other two problems that I mentioned, which is we want to do utility maximization and we're allowed to audit. So we're trying to think about what's even possible in that setting. So we found this kind of mechanism that says, I'm only going to charge people when you were allocated and when the audit said you didn't need the allocation. And that's a good idea because I want to minimize the amount of payments, right? In this utility maximization setting, it's a bad thing to charge people. And so I want to use payments to provide incentives, but I want to use them as little as possible. And so in equilibrium, what's going to happen is that people are going to only report that they need the food when they have a pretty high probability of needing it, which means that I'm going to impose these payments relatively rarely. And as compared to other economic mechanisms that don't rely on audits, we can prove that we end up with lower payments. So as compared to the second price auction, which is an economically efficient mechanism that's kind of a reference point in mechanism design, we are able to get the same outcome and lower payments, which, if you're following along at home, if you're a sort of economic theory person, you might say that violates the revenue equivalence theorem. How is that possible? It's possible because of auditing. So the revenue equivalence theorem doesn't apply to settings with auditing. We can similarly apply this mechanism, this same kind of auditing idea, this waste not pay not idea, to any mechanism with payments. And in that way, we can construct a provably optimal auditing mechanism that intuitively combines a similar sort of second price idea with entirely random allocations. So that's nice. So we did a little piece of economic theory. Then we went a little further and said, okay, we want this to actually make sense in the food bank setting. That was a nice piece of theory, but it isn't going to, it isn't really the case that food banks have 0-1 demand where they want everything or nothing at all. So we generalized to the case of multi-unit demand. Here we weren't able to prove what the optimal mechanism would be because essentially we don't even know what the optimal thing to do without auditing would be in this case. The optimal social utility mechanism isn't even known. And so we can't prove that what we're doing is optimal. We don't have a reference point. But we can add auditing to the Vickery-Clark-Groves mechanism, which is the social efficiency mechanism in this setting. And we can show that we obtain higher utility. So you can think of this as saying, as compared to the best thing we would know how to do otherwise, we can make an improvement. Another thing, of course, that we want to do is to get rid of money. So in this multi-unit demand setting, we're still talking about allocations with money, which I have told you we wish we wouldn't have to do. We can move to a setting with repeated interactions where we say, look, this food bank allocation problem is not something that happens once and then the world ends. It's kind of something that happens once a week until the end of time. And we can notice that this repeated setting gives us a mechanism for punishing people that doesn't involve money. So intuitively, I can say, if you ask for food and then don't use it, and the audit shows you not to have used it, then instead of charging you money the way the waste not pay not mechanism would do, I can instead make you sit out a few rounds in the mechanism. I can say, you're no longer allowed to participate for a little while until you kind of pay your debt to society for having asked for something that you didn't use. And that, from an incentive point of view, that sort of withholding the opportunity to gain in the future behaves kind of like a payment, but it doesn't require us to have money changing hands. And so, we formally showed how you could set such a thing up and how it would work. Okay, so let's step back then and think about the pros and cons of what just happened. So we began by thinking about some core issues that arose in an interaction that happens between food banks and food pantries. Stochastic demand, a desire to maximize utility, which is to say to try to make a good allocation while simultaneously minimizing payments. I mean, notice even when we get away from payments and we're in this repeated interaction setting, I still want to minimize the extent to which I force people to sit out, right? Because those are food pantries that actually want to serve their communities. They have hungry people, and we're telling them, because you misbehaved in the last round, you have to not participate. So that's still something we would like to do as little of as possible. And this ability to audit consumption that we note that charities are able to do. In response to this model, we came up with some meaningful new theory that people in mechanism design auction theory look at and say, that really moves the ball down the field. That's publishable work at a top theory conference. But we didn't end up in the case where food banks were beating down our door. And if we think about it, maybe this makes sense. There are a number of ways that our model is not rich enough to capture the core things that are going on for food banks. They sell more than one kind of food, they have to allocate more than one kind of food. And food pantries have disparate preferences across these different kinds of food that they try to allocate, some of which have different transportation costs and longer shelf lives and these other kinds of issues. Their preferences are often combinatorial. So, you might have, a need for pasta, but not a need for peanut butter, or there might be 5 different kinds of canned goods and you want some of them, but not all of them at the same time. Finally, it's not even clear that this incentive problem that we spoke about is the first order issue for food banks. So it definitely happens. It definitely causes problems in the allocations that they make, but it's not clear that it's so important that it ought to trump other concerns that we might have about fairness and about limiting waste. So it might simply be unacceptable to food banks to tell some of the food pantries that they have to sit out some of the rounds because they've misbehaved. Furthermore, because demand is stochastic in our setting, even food pantries that are behaving honestly are sometimes going to be punished. And that might be perceived as so unfair or so unreasonable that the whole system would be politically unworkable. Okay, I'm going to come back to this and reflect a little bit more on this example. For now, I want to shift gears and talk about a second project. But you've all been very quiet, so I imagine this could be because you're all so polite and Canadian. It could be because nobody wants to go first. It could be because market design is not your thing. Or some combination of all of this, or something else entirely. This might nevertheless be a good time to see whether anyone has something they'd like to say. And if not, I will keep plowing on. Martin, you look like you just unmuted yourself. Is that because you want to say something? Or you just unmuted yourself? I
had been unmuted already.
Oh, you've just been playing it fast and loose, unmuted.
Yes. I must say I'm one of these people who are not so much.
Yes, I have already found a guide through your platform. So let me.
All right. We heard somebody who we can't see on video, and then we lost you. So.
Yeah, Martin, continue. Go ahead.
I don't know if Martin was trying to say something or if he was just sad that I called on him when he had nothing to say.
No, I just wanted to say I'm one of these people who need a moment to digest this topic of market design, because this is not my favorite or not so close to my own research.
Well, thanks for being a good sport anyway. It looks like we have somebody putting up his hand. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you so much for your interesting presentation. I have a couple of questions. When you mentioned that the demand is stochastic, can you model the demand in the problem in this kind of framework, or how would that be applied in practice? And the other question is, you mentioned about the utility maximization of maximizing efficiency minus the payments. And how do you measure the efficiency in this problem? Like, what's the measure of efficiency?
Yeah, so I mean, the measure of efficiency, that's a great question. We're imagining that every food bank has the same utility for consuming food, for allocating food to their community, and that they have this stochastic demand. So they have, in every round, an expected probability, expected utility that comes from the probability that they will in fact be able to allocate, multiplied by kind of 1 if they allocate and 0 if they don't. So everybody has a utility in that round, sort of an expected ex interim utility that comes from their knowledge of their stochastic demand profile and the the utility they would get if they allocate. They don't get to observe the realization, so they have to do it based on this stochastic process.
Okay. And how do you measure the efficiency?
That's what I'm saying. That's how we measure the efficiency, right? So it's the expected utility across the whole population. So if you have a 60% chance of demanding food in a round and Martin has an 80% chance, then you would have, allocating to you would give me an expected utility of 0.6, and allocating to Martin would have an expected utility of 0.8, right? So it would, on average, be more efficient to allocate to him than to you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Excuse me,
Yeah,
Kevin. Now I have a question. Right? Coming from a data mining, machine learning perspective, right? I mean, how can we make use of historic data, right? I mean, basically, these agents making their requests is one thing, right? But we can look at their past performance. What could we learn from this?
That's a fantastic question. I mean, let me say, my last NSERC grant was the fundamental story of the grant was it's an embarrassment that economics essentially ignores data in the design of economic mechanisms. That we have this sort of game theoretic prior that says people are going to act in a self-interested kind of way, and this prior is so strong that we don't have anything left to use data in combination with it. And this is a kind of profound philosophical problem about market design. That we would really like a mechanism that sort of pays attention to its experiences with the world, and that it kind of adapts the way it works over time. And the field has not really figured out how to do this, and I think it's pretty clear that 10 or 20 years from now, this is going to be commonplace. So we have to find a way of bringing together what we know about incentives with what we know about learning from data. This particular work doesn't do it, and we're not alone in not doing that. I think it's something that fundamentally, I mean, there's sort of key technical reasons why this is hard to do well, but that shouldn't discourage us from trying. I think it's really important. Okay,
thanks.
well, thanks for the questions. Feel free to, again, the best way to signal to me that you have something to say is to go in the participants list and do raise hand, which will put a little, and turn your video on, and then it'll put a little icon beside your name. But anyway, then I'll keep going now. So I'm going to shift gears completely and talk about an entirely distinct question here, which is a project that I've been involved in since, I think, 2010, so now for more than a decade, on trying to address agricultural market inefficiency in Uganda. And this is a project with a couple of collaborators at Makerere University in Uganda, Richard Sechibule and John Quinn. And then, as I'll describe, we ended up in 2018 rebooting this project with a big team of people, both at UBC, at Berkeley and UCSD, and at Microsoft Research. So all these other people that you see here are from that reboot. So this has been a really, the first project that I told you about was kind of an attempt to do some economic theory work around a problem that we thought had social meaning. This project is kind of the opposite. This is an attempt to do something in practice that really helps people, and sort of secondarily try to figure out what the academic questions are. So I want to tell you sort of how that worked and what I think I learned from that experience. So subsistence, so let me tell you, all of these pictures that I'm showing you here are pictures that I took myself. So this is really like what I saw when I was in Uganda. This isn't like stock images that I found on Google. Subsistence agriculture is I think probably the main occupation in Uganda, and it's what most people do. The country really understands itself as being very focused on agriculture, and so helping the lot of subsistence farmers is maybe the most fundamental thing that could really move the needle in Uganda. If you talk to farmers, if you talk to just about anyone in Uganda, something that you learn is that buyers and sellers have a really hard time finding each other. So there are lots of people growing a crop that just can't find a market for that crop. They can't find somebody to come and buy from them. And they have a lot of anxiety about it because they harvest once or twice a year, and their family's livelihood might, they mostly produce food to eat, but then they might have some surplus produce that they want to sell. And it makes a big difference to them if they can find a market for this crop. farmers waste a lot of time transporting produce to market before they know whether the market wants their produce, waiting by the side of the road in the hopes that somebody will come buy from them. And sometimes in the cities, there will be bizarre periods of time where you just can't buy a certain food. You know, I would go to the market in the city and like there would be no tomatoes one day. And, you know, Uganda is a equatorial country given over mostly to farmland. There's absolutely no reason why I shouldn't be able to buy tomatoes every day, right? So if you're looking at this through an economic lens, this is a really classic market failure, right? If you have on the one hand people producing something who want to sell it, and on the other hand people who demand something and want to buy it, and they just can't find each other, then there's a social utility loss happening. There's the opportunity to make a change to the way things work that would make everybody better off. And as a computer scientist, this is exciting because it's really an information failure, right? The problem is that buyers don't know about the sellers and sellers don't know about the buyers. So, you know, one thing you might worry about when you reach a conclusion like this about a society that you don't live in and that you don't richly understand is that, you know, you might be missing something, as of course we repeatedly found that we were. So one way that you can double check that is to look at historical data about prevailing prices and ask whether in retrospect arbitrage opportunities existed, right? So how would you arbitrage crops? There's kind of two ways. One thing you might do is buy crops in one city and rent a truck, pay a driver, and take that truck and move the crops to a different city and then turn around and sell them at prevailing prices. And if in historical data there were patterns that you could employ like that would consistently make you a profit, that's an indication that the market is not working properly, because these differences in a well-functioning market should arbitrage away. Another form of arbitrage that could exist is you could buy up a crop that doesn't spoil, like dried corn or beans, and you could rent a warehouse and you could pay a security guard and a fumigator and a landlord, and then you could warehouse the crop for 4 months and turn around and sell it at the prevailing prices. And if you could consistently make a profit by doing that in historical data, that's another good indicator that there's something going wrong in the market. And looking through historical data, doing this kind of data analysis, we indeed found that there were really pronounced arbitrage opportunities. Actually, giving an early version of this talk in Uganda, I saw one guy go really pale and look really worried, and he came to me after the talk and he said, "This is how I make my living. You know, you're telling people my secret. You know, this is how I support my family, by doing this kind of arbitrage." And I said, the problem is you're not doing enough of this arbitrage. If you're doing it well enough, then I wouldn't see it in the data, and the market would be operating efficiently. But you're too small to move the market, so the arbitrage opportunity still exists, and it shows that the problem is bigger than you. So all of which is to say people know about this problem, but it doesn't solve itself. So, we originally sort of liked the idea that, farmers in the rural areas and customers would sort of meet up because, we had the experience of being customers and seeing how badly the market functioned. But we ultimately quickly realized that the last step in the chain of the market is pretty efficient. So the people in the cities who buy things in bulk are pretty good at then redistributing what they buy into the markets and into the food processing plants, and that stage of the chain turns out to work pretty efficiently. What doesn't work very efficiently is those kind of middlemen in the cities don't do a very good job of finding farmers. And the problem is that the farmers are generally kind of small producers. They don't transact in the market very often. They a lot of this stuff sort of happens through personal connections. They might know one trader. That trader might go out of business or might make a unreasonable deal because they know they're the only person the farmer can deal with. So that kind of link between farmers in the villages and markets in the city is weak. And this turned out to be the problem that we wanted to address. Now, again, these are pictures that I took myself. You know, you'll notice that the guy on the right, who's showing us his storefront in Kampala, where he buys maize and mills it and then sells it to food processors. You know, he's holding a phone in his hand, and it looks, you know, more or less like the kind of phone that you or I probably have. The guy on the left is a farmer in a rural area, and he's also holding a phone. And depending on how old you are, this might look like the first phone you ever owned. Or if you're younger than me, it might look like the first phone that your parents ever owned. But it's a phone that you probably can't even buy in Canada today. So this is a so-called feature phone. It's not a smartphone. It doesn't get data. It can send text messages. It can do something called USSD that we don't really have in Canada, that is essentially a sort of message-based text message interface that allows some sort of basic kind of session where you can, you know, repeatedly send text messages to an automated system, but that's about as fancy as it gets. On the other hand, you do notice that this guy in a place that's so rural that it doesn't have electricity, where he really, you know, I didn't pose him, like this really is his hoe. This is how he farms his field. He still has a phone, and, you know, he still has reception out there. So, you know, it's really kind of amazing how telecoms have transformed life in rural Uganda. And, you know, I took this picture with my phone, and, you know, I had 3G out there. So, so there's an opportunity here where technology has come in, where in principle, you know, there's the hope that that this new technology can be disruptive and can be used to try to link people together. So that's what we aim to do. So we produce, we made a system called Kudu, which, if you're wondering, is a kind of antelope that lives in Uganda, which is an agricultural market that runs over feature phones. So this is one of our village outreach agents who's wearing a T-shirt that told people how they used in training sessions to show people how to use Kudu. So you can see his T-shirt. And basically, you can send a text message to a code that was free of charge, depending on what network you were on, saying that you wanted to sell crops in some quantity to a short code, to 8228, and you would get sort of put into a market. So it's kind of like the Chicago Mercantile Exchange meets Craigslist running over your grandmother's phone. And that's what we tried to do. You know, the sense in which it's the Chicago Mercantile Exchange is that we're trading commodities. So one person's, you know, 1 ton of maize is pretty much another guy's 1 ton of maize. So it's not like everything is distinct. It's not like I'm selling my dresser in a classified ad, and, you know, you have to come take a look at the picture of the dresser to see whether you want it. We're selling something that's a commodity, and that gives us the ability to thicken the market and put people together. On the other hand, you know, we have prices and quantities and geography to deal with, and all of this has to happen over SMS. So when we first built the model, the market back in, I think we initially went live in 2013, we did automated matching the way economic theory would tell us we should do. So we began by running a greedy algorithm because we were lazy and we did something stupid, but really what we should have done was maximum weighted bipartite matching, which is what we eventually did. Where basically you have a bipartite graph with the buyers on one side and the sellers, the farmers, on the other side, and the sellers post prices saying, I'm willing to sell, you know, my crop for this amount, and the buyers say, I'm willing to pay this amount, and then you look for where there would be profitable trades between them, and you trade at the farmers' posted prices, which gives an incentive to the buyers to report their demand honestly. And you see what you can do, and you tell people you got matched, go for it, trade with each other. We ran a limited trial based on like a little bit of grant money we could scrounge together, where we did small scale radio ads. It's crazy. In Uganda, you can actually pay DJs to just talk about your service on the radio for like half an hour, even though they know nothing about it. And it isn't like we ran radio ads that took like 10 seconds. Like we gave a little script to DJs and they would just go on and on about kudu and how you could trade your crops. I have no idea what they said because these radio ads were not in English. I'm sure it was not entirely accurate, but it really worked. We got all these people to go on the system. You can see we got sort of maybe hundreds, thousands of users. People sent in, we gave them this sort of formal language. They should text us an SMS, and people did randomly whatever. They sent us natural language. They just sort of chatted with us over SMS. So eventually we hired a student to try to fix malformed SMS messages to make the machine readable. We also did limited outreach to buyers where we went around in Kampala, met with people, told them about kudu, got them to participate in the system. So what happened? Well, we got a bunch of users. We made a bunch of matches. And did anyone actually trade? It's hard to say, right? We put people together. We said, you both said you were interested in trading. You've got, you guys meet on price. You've got something to sell that this guy wants to buy and he wants to pay less than you want to sell it for. So here, now we've given you each other's phone numbers. God bless you. We hope everything works out well for you. And that's kind of what we knew at that point. Because, how would you figure it out afterwards? So we see that there was a lot of interest and enthusiasm. The system got a bunch of use. We ran out of money because, we were running this off a tiny insert grant, and we stopped advertising, and the harvest season ended, and we didn't have a student to fix the SMS messages anymore. We kind of retired it, and we thought, okay, we sort of learned something that was pretty interesting, but it didn't transform the way agriculture happened in Uganda. In 2018, we got interested in trying this again, and we got back together with the team from Makerere. One of my graduate students, Neil Newman, got involved. We had a group at San Diego and Berkeley of development economists who were interested in studying agricultural interventions in Uganda, who found out about our original paper and reached out to us and said, we've got a huge amount of funding to try to study the impact of agricultural interventions. We want to use your system, and we're going to put all kinds of people on the ground in the villages. We're going to measure the effect of the intervention. We want to see what happens. And we also got a couple of people who work in market design and Microsoft Research who wanted to help us out, and so we worked with them too. So we ended up hiring a call center, which you can see on the bottom right, that was sitting in an office in Kampala, and people would phone in, and all of these people were working like business hours every single day. We had this team of kind of managers you see in the top right that was overseeing the call center and trying to make this whole thing work. In the bottom left, we had this bunch of agricultural outreach workers that were embedded in villages all around the country that would go out and actually train people, meet with farmers, try to tell them about the system. And we also worked with AgriNet, which you see in the upper left, which was a private company in Uganda that was trying to also kind of work in the villages, offer people crop insurance, offer people transportation to village centers, that was sort of trying to help to bridge the gap in the villages. So we ended up with this big team of people on the ground to really try to make this a reality and to try to study the effect. We ended up registering tens of thousands of users. You can see, the scale of what happened in a kind of cumulative distribution on the left here between the original trial we did in 2013, our kind of long period of being quiet, and then, our second big study. And on the right, I'm showing it kind of as a histogram where I'm showing both existing users and new users. So you see, there were both people coming back and repeatedly using the system, and there were people coming in for the first time. So we got a lot of activity. Something that having this big practical study allowed us to do was to actually phone people up that we had matched and say, did you actually trade? As we phoned both sides of the trade, and we said, did you actually trade? Why or why not? What did you trade? What was the price eventually? Really expensive, as you can imagine, to do that. Sometimes people don't answer the phone. Sometimes people never want to deal with you again after the trade has happened. So these are kind of underestimates. These are the people we actually managed to confirm with. But you see that we did almost $2 million of trades, most of all in maize. About half of our trades were in maize, but then there's kind of a long tail of other crops that we were also making markets in. And the activity was all over the place. So some of the activity was people trading very near their own villages, so trading to kind of market makers that were very near them. About a third of our activity was people traveling sort of, I think, less than 20 miles. About a third was people traveling sort of moderate distances, and about a third was people driving all the way across the country. And if you've ever traveled by land in Uganda from one rural area to another, you know that's not a small thing to do. It's the transportation infrastructure is not like it is in Canada. So people were really motivated to find these markets and to make them, particularly in the market for maize, but also in some other cases as well. And how did the market work? We began by doing manual matching, where deal coordinators, who were these people that I showed you pictures of, were phoning people up saying, hey, I've got this database that looks like what I'm showing you here, and I sort of found you. You're in Liama Parish, and I think I found another guy who's in Quera Parish, which isn't too far away from you, and we think maybe the two of you could trade. And like, what if and they bounce back and forth, and they do this all kind of wheeling dealing by hand, incredibly laborious. As you would imagine, this is not what we wanted. We wanted to be doing this manual matching, this automatic matching. But the deal coordinators really wanted to do this matching themselves. They made us, persuaded us to make this kind of interface for them. When it came time to contact a seller, we built them this interface where they would go in and they would say, here are potential sellers, did it work out or not? Once I have so they would sort of work on behalf of a buyer. So they'd find an interested buyer. They would then sort of filter by people the buyer might be interested in. They would go down and phone people and make notes about what happened and sort of broker trades. Why did we have trouble building a system that was fully automatic here? There were a lot of issues. So we actually went out on some field visits and saw training sessions happen in the villages. I'm showing you on the left, here's actually what our deployed system looked like. On the right, I'm showing you a training session where they told a bunch of farmers in a village, like, hey, we're going to come by and tell you about this crazy new technology called Kudu that you can use to buy and sell your crops. And all these people showed up and they were interested, and nobody was paying them to be there. And you can see one of the outreach guys pointing at the shirt on the instructions on the back, telling people how to phone in. So you see, we had to deal with the fact that there are many different languages in Uganda. So some people speak English, but a lot of people speak Luganda or Luau or other tribal languages. There's sort of a long tail of different languages. So sometimes buyers and sellers wouldn't even speak the same language. That was a challenge. A lot of farmers were illiterate, and so a text message-based interface was difficult for them. They actually had to find a family member who could actually operate the phone for them because they couldn't understand what the messages back from the system meant. Ultimately, we learned when we were studying the system that fewer than 10% of the trades that we proposed completed. And there were lots of reasons why. Some of it was modeling issues. So trades that looked good to us were less good than they looked because it was very hard for us to understand which pairings were sort of feasible transportation challenges and which were not. On the right side, I'm showing you on the top the sort of main road going from Kampala to Gulu. So it's sort of one of the main arterial corridors in Uganda. This is sort of the Trans-Canada Highway of Uganda. The picture on the right is a sort of typical sort of secondary road in Uganda. And imagine what it would be like to have a 13-ton truck filled with bananas driving along on this road. It's not the easiest thing, even when it's dry and after it's just rained. You can imagine it's a pretty big problem. So it wasn't always such an easy thing to get a big trailer full of crops to actually go to pick up a crop that we match somebody with. Reliability was also a big problem. So both buyers and sellers would promise things that they would ultimately not do. Finding ways to encourage trust on the system was a difficult thing. Another really difficult problem was that farmers, they're poor, they're really liquidity constrained. They typically took on debt to buy their seeds, and then once they had these crops, they wanted to sell them as quickly as possible to pay off their debts. And so they would say that they wanted to sell something, but if a deal didn't materialize sort of in hours, they would just maybe sell to somebody else off the platform and not tell us about it. So we had to really think about the tempo of this thing, how to make the timing happen quickly. It's not like computers can't do things quickly, but the problem was we had to thicken the market. The market wasn't necessarily big enough that we would have a good counterparty for them in a really short amount of time. And there was also a kind of traveling salesman problem underlying this whole thing, because a truck might need to visit several farmers in order to pick up enough stuff to make a big trip across the country worthwhile. And if proposed trades were falling apart a lot, we would have to repair solutions to actually make this whole trip worthwhile for a buyer. Nevertheless, we built a system that people used. Nevertheless, there were all kinds of problems with it. In the end, what we did was really labor intensive. So it was possible to do because we had this call center and all these people in villages and people phoning up people asking whether the transactions really went through by phone. We were building a market that was helping people, but that wasn't collecting any money from anybody. So it wasn't sustainable. It was being run through a research grant. Once the grant money ended and the experimental economists went home, we weren't able to keep the thing running. So Kudu kind of paused again. We're now in the process of trying to build another reboot, and we've been trying to think about what a leaner version of Kudu would look like. So what appeals to us is the idea, the deal coordinators were probably the most laborious part of the system. We really had to have people individually matchmaking with buyers and sellers. We obviously want to automate that process in some way. And the idea that appealed to us is trying to offload this search problem to the buyer side. So it seems to us that while the sellers tend to be very low tech, the buyers are often higher tech. It's more reasonable for us to think that the buyers who live in cities and have enough access to capital to own trucks and to be buying crops in bulk might own smartphones. So our goal is to take the workflow that we understood through the deal coordinators and to kind of build it out into a smartphone application so that buyers can basically do what the deal coordinator was doing on their behalf. They can sort of browse a set of sell orders that exist and phone people up and basically act as their own deal coordinator. And they can do this through an interface that allows them to express richer preferences over location and quantity and price than would have been possible to do just through this SMS interface. And conversely, we would accept asks from sellers through the structured SMS approach we had before, also maybe through a very small call center that would interact with people through SMS and WhatsApp, let people just kind of type comments in and sort of clean them up and put them into the interface. So in the end, we built an Android application that kind of looks like this, where you can say, I want to buy or sell cassava or mushrooms or chia, different crops that people have told us they care about. Then they can, you get sort of a Yelp style interface where you sort of want to filter on price, you want to filter on quantity, you say how recent a bid you're interested in seeing, then you kind of create a filter, and then you can see on a map who has said that they're interested, and then you can just contact these people directly. So it ends up being sort of somewhere between a bidding interface and a classified ad kind of interface where then you can sort of broker with people directly. And so that's what we've been in the process of building out. It's not live yet. We hope it will go live soon. As always, it's really challenging because it's really just necessary to work with local partners. We don't have a lot of control over the degree of engagement of the local partners that we work with. So as I did with the previous problem, let me just kind of now kind of try to analyze some pros and cons. I think after a decade of working on this problem, I'm really convinced that this problem of agricultural markets in Uganda being inefficient is a really compelling and important one. I do really believe that an electronic market that can connect buyers and sellers across the country is a meaningful one, particularly for matching people together. But actually, something I didn't emphasize in this talk, but that turned out to be really relevant to us was if you do a certain amount of matching, you also, as a kind of data mining side effect, you start to learn what the prices should be. And actually, one of the main things that Kudu turned out to do in our last deployment was just to tell people the prices at which trades were happening. Because people don't, the farmers don't really have a good sense of what the crop prices ought to be. And that really disempowers them. And so if we can just tell them the prices at which trades are happening, even if they trade off platform, it really helps them. So that again makes it very hard for us to measure our impact. But I think for every farmer who traded on Kudu, there were 10 farmers who were getting price bulletins from us and using them to negotiate off platform. We had a long and twisting road, as I told you, to our current point, where we got reasonable traction, but certainly no explosion of use. We encountered real technical challenges, but never found a really big theoretical result. We actually have published on some theory problems, particularly on how to match buyers and sellers in a two-sided market where arrival and departure is stochastic. Whoops, I see the video pausing. I hope that doesn't mean you can't hear me. Okay, I see you back. Hello, everybody. I hope you can still hear me. I'm waiting to see somebody wave, which will reassure me that you can hear the audio. That's good. Anyway, so we sort of made some progress. Some of the things that really appealed to us didn't work, and there's clearly a lot of work still to be done. So there's still a lot of work on kind of market design, usability, how to make this whole thing profitable. What are mechanisms by which we can market this at scale? We're really interested in sort of viral marketing mechanisms we might use over social media to try to reach people. Facebook has become a big thing in the developing world. And we still really hope that success is around the corner. We still have people using the system. We still have a lot of kind of people know about us now in Uganda, so we still really hope that there's scope for this thing to continue to work out. Okay, so I'm coming near to the end of the time, but I want to have a couple more slides just to reflect on what I think we can learn from this. So scope out from these two example projects that I've told you about, and try to think about what we can learn from this and what this means for kind of AI data science work for social impact in general. This is work that I've done jointly with Scott Commoners at the Harvard Business School. So something kind of obvious, but that maybe deserves being said, it's really hard to develop AI technologies at all, right? They even if you've got a straightforwardly stated problem, it's often really hard to bring AI technologies to bear because they can be computationally intractable or provably impossible. So AI scientists tend to be trained to do lots of very clever work to think about how to approximate the problem, reformulate it, relax it, find heuristics. And we have a kind of culture and an academic literature that focuses on coming up with these kinds of clever ideas and communicating them to each other so that others don't need to reinvent the wheel every time they face a different problem. As a kind of social question, it's worth thinking about what happens when you take a bunch of researchers who were trained under this kind of methodology that all of us were. We're not social scientists. What happens? Well, it seems to me there are kind of two key models that happen, which I think the two examples that I've told you about sort of exemplify. The first model, I'm going to kind of caricature both of them, but I would call the first model write a paper. Right? So the way this works is you get approached by a stakeholder with a good idea about how your research expertise aligns with some social problem. And you talk with them, you take a meeting or two, and you probably don't really dig in with them unless you start to see the kernel of some kind of idea where your expertise, something that you feel you really understand well, might deeply move the needle on their application problem. And then, if so, you say, yeah, let's get a grant together. Let's initiate a collaboration. This seems like a place where something positive might happen. And what do you then do? You try to abstract a clean statement of the problem, and then you try to solve that clean abstraction of the problem. recognizing that it's not the real problem, but iteratively trying to make the problem more and more realistic as you make headway with it. And if you find that your clean statement is trivial or is addressed by existing work, you might make the problem more complex. If you find that you're getting stuck and you can't make any headway, you might make the problem yet simpler. And you keep kind of exploring the space in this way until you find a positive result, where you've said something that hasn't been said before. And at this point, you're likely to remark to your collaborators, I'm sure we have a paper. Here's something that we could actually submit to AAAI or KDD or wherever it is that you submit your papers. And at this point, you see how much you can generalize or elaborate or understand the model more deeply, kind of until the conference deadline comes along. And then you write it up and you send it off and you hope that you've made the world a better place and you move on. And certainly some of my work, I think, our work on the food bank problem falls into that recipe. Maybe you can think of examples in your own work or in your field where other people have followed this kind of model. And I think, there's nothing wrong with it, but the contact with the underlying problem is maybe not that profound. The probability that this work by itself will really move the needle on the social problem is, I think, a little limited. The second kind of project model that you might follow, and I think this is the kudu story that I told you about might exemplify, is that you think of yourself more as an entrepreneur than as an academic researcher. And then you sort of approach the problem in the way that you would approach the problem of trying to start a startup. So you might follow the sort of lean startup recipe that's popular in business schools, where you try to understand the market as well as you can, but you don't spend too long on it. Then you build a prototype that addresses something that you think might help. You get a bunch of user feedback about that prototype, and you see what users don't like about it. And then you pivot to the extent necessary. You try to quickly take that user feedback on board, build a new prototype that addresses whatever people seem to really want, and you kind of keep repeating this until you run out of money and the venture capitalists pull the plug on you, and then you go home. Or you make Instagram and wonderful things happen to you. It's worth noticing that the conventional wisdom about startups is that 90% of startups fail. And this is true even if they're not trying to simultaneously develop novel AI research. This is true even if they're just trying to get people to share pictures with each other using their phones. Mostly it's just really hard to guess right about which approaches will meet people's needs and match up a technology with a market. So if you're also trying to develop new AI technologies and focus on addressing under-resourced communities, this doesn't make it easier to build a successful startup. It makes it harder. And so if you're going to try to lock into a solution right at the beginning, you're less likely to be impactful in practice for the same reasons that startups that lock in right at the beginning aren't likely to succeed. And if you focus on trying to make a difference, you're more likely to drift away from your core expertise as you repeatedly pivot. And you might find yourself, just trying to build, a web app or something rather than, doing the kind of core data mining, machine learning work that you feel that you deeply know how to move the needle on. Now, of course, the kind of holy grail, what everybody wishes they could do, is this sort of project model number 3, which is, write a profound paper that is recognized by your field as a deep intellectual contribution while simultaneously meeting an untapped market need and making the world a better place. And, there's sort of 2 ways that this might happen, right? There's the kind of unsatisfying approach is that you do these 2 things in parallel. So, you do the lean startup thing, and then you kind of throw off some papers at the same time that have pretty loose causal connections to what you're in fact doing, what you're in fact building, but at least you're doing both of these things at the same time. I'm not going to name names, but I can think of some prominent examples of researchers in the kind of social good space who do work that I think might have this kind of loose causal connection. Maybe you can think of some examples too. If you can't, then your heart hasn't been broken yet. I'm happy for you. But I think some of this stuff exists. On the other hand, there are some real success stories where there really have been meaningful links between novel AI research ideas and meaningful social impact. So, I think the question that we should ask ourselves is whether these projects got lucky or whether they did something that everybody else didn't know how to do. That's sort of the million-dollar question here. And, again, not naming names, but trying to reflect on cases that we find the most meaningful in terms of having really developed novel technologies and made a social impact at the same time. It seems to us that novelty and problem formulation is an ingredient that has been at least as important for these projects as the difficulty of the technical solution that they brought to bear on that problem formulation. So this work doesn't tend to look like applying an existing recipe that's already present in the work to kind of a known problem formulation. It often involves reconceptualizing a problem. It's also pretty clear that teams that have been successful have a kind of hidden superpower that they don't talk about very much, but that is pretty important for them, which is the ability to communicate with and understand their stakeholders. So it's pretty important for them to have partners embedded in the real world. There aren't a lot of cases where academics working entirely by themselves just propose something about some social problem and then the world went off and adopted it. It tends to be a really deep and ongoing partnership between kind of receptor communities and academics with sort of AI data mining experience. To that vein, it really helps to have a partner who's kind of proactively trying to be a receptor. So some of the most successful cases are actually initiated by a pretty technologically savvy end user or somebody in an organization who really understands computer science, who reaches out to the researchers and knows how to be the bridge between the rest of their organization and the computer scientists who want to work with them. So, and that's because it's just pretty hard to understand the internal politics, understand what's really important, and to really know how to make a difference to those problem domains. So if you're interested in doing meaningful AI for social impact work, I think it's really important to look for such partners and for us as a community to really think about how we might identify, support, and grow such people out in these receptor communities, because I think they're really a critical ingredient to making this work successful. I think this is the last thing that I'm going to say before I conclude. Just sort of reflecting on how we might think about teaching on this topic and how we might think about growing the community. I think if we want to think about how to teach computer science students on how to do good AI for social impact kind of work, I think we need to look to business schools and engineering schools for the way that they teach these sorts of topics, maybe absent the technical ingredient. I've become really interested in the way that business schools use case-based teaching to think through the way enterprises reason about concrete challenges and about how we might incorporate some of those teaching methodologies into more technical domains like the ones that we face. It's pretty clear that we need experiential kind of project-based learning, but I think a lot of our sort of experiential learning like co-ops or big project courses are insufficiently scaffolded. So I think what's really important is not so much just giving people the experience of building something, but really giving people the experience of reformulating a project in an expert kind of way, where you think about how do I pivot, how do I understand what was going wrong before, and really understand this kind of lean pivoting methodology. So not just putting a bunch of students out and having them give you back a project and then grading it, but really helping them to think through this pivoting cycle. In terms of how we can encourage such work in our research community, I think we need to seek out and develop partners at least as much as we seek out and develop projects. I think we need to look for innovation in our business model or application strategy at least as much in methodology. So I think we really in our conferences tend to focus too much on technically innovative work rather than methodologically innovative work. And it's tough. We have a bit of a bias towards new algorithms and better algorithmic results rather than profound reformulations of a problem and arguments based on the existing literature from outside our field that this is a more important problem. But I think we need to do a better job of helping to foster that kind of work so that we can share best practices about processes and not just kind of celebrate outcomes. So overall, I think if what we need is really to shift towards this kind of lean startup sort of methodology, we need to find ways of rewarding it in our research communities and of teaching it to our students. And I think it's not simple, it's not sexy, it's not something we can do in 5 minutes. But I think if this is really what we care about doing, it's something we have to pay attention to. So, so in conclusion, I think if we want to impact society, I think we can just try to write a paper, and I think sometimes good work can happen that way. I told you about some work of my own that I'm not embarrassed about, as much as it hasn't changed the way food banks allocate food in the world. We can just try to be an entrepreneur. I think that can also lead us to learn a lot and do good work, although maybe not our most technical work. And if we really strive hard, we can try to have it all. Sometimes this work misses the mark, but it can produce really shining successes that I think are inspirational and really help to move our field forward. I think it's still hard work to understand what separates these two families of outcomes. But overall, I think all of this is worth doing. I think all of you showed up for this talk because we have a moral obligation. I think it's pretty clear, AI technology should not be only about how can we best target advertisements in people's news feeds so we can best manipulate elections. I think we really want to think about how new technologies can positively transform people's lives and particularly help to impact underserved communities and help our whole societies to benefit. So I hope that we're all going to continue to work on this as we go forward. Thanks a lot for your attention, and thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for the great talk. Yeah, it's very inspiring, and I think I see some audience already sent some comments. Remika says, where can we accessing the recording, and upon the agreement from the speaker, we may put the recording online. And Remika said that this is a topic to reflect upon later. I will certainly be thinking about those key questions for a while. Amazing work. I'm inspired and more curious. Thank you for sharing your experience, Professor Leyton-Brown.
Thanks very much. And of course, I'm happy for you to post the video. Thanks very much.
Great. It is now open for questions, and anyone, please just raise your hand or just turn on your video and chat. So maybe I can come up with the first question. Indeed, I went through some steps in this process too. I find the most challenging part indeed is the data collection. I mean, producing the data. Once you have the data, and then you can always find a way or the other to apply the AI. So, but now we see a lot of people talk about AI, but very few people talk about how to produce data, how to record data in an enterprise or entrepreneur way. What's your comment on that?
That's a great point. I mean, I think that the point I kind of glancingly made about how Kudu sort of tried to be a system for matching buyers and sellers, but people found it at least as useful as a system just for reporting prices, really just kind of giving aggregate information about the data that it collected, I think really speaks to your point. I think I think you're exactly right that just getting data into a form where we can work with it is often a really important challenge. I guess I have a sort of pet theory. I wonder what you think about it. That one reason why we're seeing machine learning kind of leading the way in terms of AI applications is because to a large extent, machine learning is really about getting data into computers. So a lot of the kind of machine learning applications we have, computer vision, natural language processing, really about, taking kind of raw signal data and making some good use of it, bringing it in a way that doesn't involve really laborious effort on behalf of people, to a point where we can reason about it electronically. And I think as this technology matures and becomes more commonplace, I think it's going to help to meet the need that you identified of this sort of data bottleneck. and it's going to get us to the point where reasoning about this data, thinking about how we can more sensibly leverage this data becomes possible to do, because we will have solved that first problem of just getting the data at all. So I think it sort of seems to me that the second wave of AI applications, I think the first wave is kind of how can we use machine learning to get data into a computer at all? I think the second wave is once we've done that, what do we do with the data?
Yes, I can agree with more. One question from Pei Wang is that, thanks Professor Leyton-Brown, very inspiring talk. You wrap up with very practical suggestions in choosing projects and good partners. I wonder how many times did you fail before you find an impactful project? How many potential opportunities you approached before you find one you like? Is there a systematic way to reach such opportunities?
That's a great question. Lots of times. I think you've really got to be prepared to fail, right? Particularly, it's a little hard to count because you fail at so many different stages, right? You have one conversation with somebody that just doesn't go anywhere. You might not even remember that you did it. I remember that at one point when I was on sabbatical in Uganda, I just went there kind of cold, just thinking I'm going to apply AI to social problems in Uganda, pretty naive. And I had collaborators there. We were trying to find good projects we could work on. At one point, we identified 8 different projects that we thought might make sense. And, Kudu was one of them. At that point, it was not at all clear that was the one that was going to go anywhere. We had a project on helping the police to use AI to better patrol against terrorism, because there were concerns at the time about Ethiopian radical groups that were setting off bombs in public places in Uganda, and the police were concerned about how can we patrol, and they had a crazy problem where some of the police were very badly paid, and some of them would be sent on a patrol and then they wouldn't actually do the patrol. They would just go to the bar or they would go home. And so we were thinking, how do we use GPS so we could keep track of where the police even were and find patrols that would be good? And then the police started shooting protesters in a disputed election. And we thought, okay, well, we're not going to work with them anymore. So that didn't work out. We had another project about trying to detect counterfeit drugs that were being sold on the market. We had a very clever idea, I thought, but then the agency stopped meeting with us, and we started to suspect they might have actually been part of selling the counterfeit drugs, and they didn't want us to succeed. So there are lots of ways that things can go wrong, or you just have an idea that sort of sounds nice to you, but you turn out not to be able to get the data, or it doesn't really seem like you're addressing the core problem. This kind of thing happens all the time. So I think you really have to be willing to just, if you sort of have the attitude that it's going to take 3 to 6 months to come up with a problem and write a paper about it and move on to your next problem, you're very unlikely to make an impact in the world. You really have to be willing to have a long fuse and have a lot of pokers in the fire and just kind of keep trying. If you're a student, you might feel like this is risky. And I guess what I would say is, I haven't published very many projects on this kind of social impact work, but those that I have had really a lot of uptake after I have published them. I think people are very excited about work like this, and they recognize that it's hard to do. So I think the academic community actually does a pretty good job of rewarding work like this once it's done. But it can be a little scary to embark upon this kind of research strategy. So I think be brave and try anyway.
Thank you.
I see Shen Wei has a hand up.
Yeah, hello, Kevin. I'm Shen Wei from Peking University, and I'm greatly inspired by your talk, and especially the project in Uganda. Actually, in China, we have some successful project by using the internet to make farmers get rid of poverty. Yeah, and I wonder, can the if the project in Uganda can make money to keep keep the daily cost. Because I think if we want to run a long-term project, we must we must make money to cover the cost. Yeah, and yes, this is the first question.
Well, I think that's a great question. So, I think we've eventually moved towards a model that is so cheap that we could almost offer it for free indefinitely. I guess if we need a call center employee sort of typing things in, that's sort of one person, but labor in Uganda is sort of $1 or $2 an hour. So, like a few $1,000s, you could keep the things running for a while. And one person could type in a lot of text messages. So it might actually be that with like very, very, computer time is essentially free, right? So you might really be able to run such a thing almost for free.
Oh yeah, that's great.
So
Yeah.
now is open source. It's based on just an Android app that anyone can download and extend. So I think there is actually some prospect that you could do such a thing for free. We certainly thought a lot about whether there might be some way to make money with such a system in order to make it self-sustaining. I think that's a very appealing idea. Certainly makes sense, right? If you're making a significant economic impact on people's lives, they ought to be willing, in principle, to pay you something for it. The reason why we never went down that road in Uganda is because electronic trading is just not a big thing. There's money really, the transaction has to happen in person. Because we're not trading a digital good, we're trading a physical good. Somebody has to physically go there before the transaction happens. And if we can't tell apart whether the transaction happened or whether it failed, we can't really take a cut. So although I tend to agree with you that the sustainability of such a system would be dramatically improved if you could make it profitable, I think it's difficult in a really really kind of developing country to take a fraction of every trade.
Yeah. And thank you. And the second question is, since the traffic in Uganda is very inconvenient, and the buyer if the buyer wants to go somewhere to meet the seller, they must have a cost in the route and on the route, and if there are some fake or some not very truthful information in the platform, that may cause some cost. Yeah, and I think if there can be something like reputation system, like we comment on the website and to for the for each
Yeah, so we do think about reputation systems quite extensively. We talk about them in some of our papers. Not surprising, coming from the kind of data mining community, this would be something you think about. I know there's a lot of literature on that. It's tricky here because there's a pretty substantial whitewashing problem, right? Anyone can just buy a new SIM card for 50 cents, in the market in Uganda and have a new identity. It's actually very common for people to have multiple SIM cards as it is in Uganda. And farmers don't trade very often, right? The people in the system typically will only have 1 or 2 harvests a year. So most of the people on the system aren't going to have a track record that we can use. So it's difficult for bad actors to have a persistently negative reputation that they wouldn't just kind of get rid of and appear to be new people. It's not to say that it's impossible, but it's a tricky thing.
Yeah, thank you. It's quite different from my image about it. Yeah, I think we need to do some practical thing to know about the African country.
Yeah, so it might well be the case in China that it's not easy to get a SIM card without having it be tied to your identity, and it would be a bit more of a persistent marker of identity. That's very much not the case in Uganda. You can just like buy it from a guy on the side of the road for like literally less than $1. You can buy airtime in increments of seconds, so you can really pay like $1 and buy a SIM card and like a minute and a half of airtime or something.
One question from Xion Lee is that thank you for the great talk. On the Uganda project, I was a little bit curious about why the market was so inefficient from the first place. The agriculture industry in Uganda must be a very old one, and with my limited knowledge in economy, I thought that over time, a society organically develops a kind of stable, optimal, coded market system. Do you think there were some historical, structural, social causes to the inefficiency, and maybe considering them could help with technical problem formulation?
Good question. So, you know, there's this sort of efficient market hypothesis, right? There's this sort of theorems in economics that say markets are going to find an equilibrium, the invisible hand is going to, you know, make everything work out. It rests on some assumptions that aren't necessarily true here. You know, one assumption that it rests on is that everybody has information about what's going on, right? If you have really profound information failures, that can be difficult. If people don't trust each other enough to physically meet, that can make things difficult. If transportation is incredibly costly and risky, you know, bandits might attack your truck in the middle of the night if you drive to a place you've never driven to before. You know, that's a real thing that people told us they were worried about. You know, that can undermine the efficiency of markets. Other issues are the availability of credit. You know, in order to have widespread arbitrage to equilibrate prices, you would need people to be able to borrow money, but you might not have a functioning financial system. There are reasons why, you know, places like Canada don't experience market failures like this, but you know, there's sort of complex systemic failures in places like Uganda that make these problems a bit more entrenched.
Yeah, may I have a follow-up question on this?
Please.
Indeed, I find this is very interesting, is how we can model culture differences for technology, because there are many culture differences are very subtle, and you don't know them until they happen, because those are things using to us. So one challenge is how to detect them in a timely manner, and also how to react to them properly.
Well, being able to, you know, in some sense, automatically detect cultural differences would be a pretty impressive AI accomplishment. I don't know if I have anything intelligent to say about how one would do that, but I think even when you're, you know, working with an expert who, you know, belongs to the culture that you're trying to have an impact upon, and, you know, you're really in a dialogue together, and you're trying to, you know, do something as carefully as you can in a way that's going to, you know, make a difference to that culture. Still really trying to understand these cultural differences is a first order issue, right? It's a really important thing. And I mean, I think, you know, just look at the way that like internet technologies have followed different trajectories in China and in North America, despite the fact that that both have, you know, very rich developed infrastructures at this point. You know, I think these differences are substantially cultural rather than technological. I think that that's a pretty good kind of controlled experiment that helps us to see the importance of culture and what, you know, what's going to make sense and what isn't. You know, we don't have an application like WeChat that you know, integrates payments and that has, you know, pervaded life in Canada the way that it has in China. There's no particular reason why it shouldn't have, besides culture, I suppose. I think that's really a hard thing to understand. I just think it's a very important thing to understand. So I'm not sure that I can give you what your question is asking for, except just to note that I think it's a really critical issue to get right.
Okay, thank you. Probably for the interest of time, we take one more question. Sanjay, sorry if I did not pronounce the name properly.
Perhaps your video has frozen. I'll give you
his video.
See whether it works for you.
Sajid, yeah, I'm here, yeah. Everyone, we'll go. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can you hear me? Hello, everyone. Thank you for the presentation. So I think we are here in Canada are doing a great job for the project model number 1, as here in many universities and research centers and great professors that we have, we write a significant number of papers every year, and we actually propose novel solutions for many problems, specifically in computer science and in AI. But the problem that it's my personal concern is that there's a significant gap between writing a paper and being an entrepreneur in Canada. I mean, there are many, many AI papers, but there are actually no AI companies. And as a result, unfortunately, Canada is not an AI superpower in comparison to, for example, US or China, which you can see and experience many, many AI products and AI services. So you mentioned that producing AI products and establishing AI companies is pretty difficult and hard task, and I totally understand. But I really would like to hear your thoughts and your comments about this, that why establishing an AI company would be very difficult, and why we don't have many AI products in Canada.
I'm not sure I agree with the premise of your question. I think Canada actually does quite well in AI. I mean, you're quite right that Canada is not as big a player in AI as China or the United States, but Canada has got a whole lot fewer people than China and the United States. And I think per capita, we're one of the biggest AI players in the world. I think we actually we were the first country to have a national AI strategy from our federal government. We have these AI research centers around the country. It's a travesty that we don't have one in Vancouver, and we absolutely should. We should all be leaning on the federal government to help them to understand that Canada doesn't end at the Rocky Mountains, that there's something over here, which all of us who live in Vancouver understand the sad difficulty of getting noticed by Ontario and Quebec. But I think there's actually a lot of AI startups, in Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, and Alberta, that are they're small. Some of them are failing, some of them are just making their mark. But I think actually there's quite a lot going on. I think the biggest problem we have in Canada is that we don't really have a Silicon Valley. We don't have a venture capital ecosystem that makes it easy to fund and incubate and grow startups. I think our funders in Canada tend to be very conservative. They're really interested in medium-sized companies with an existing record of success, rather than very speculative companies. I think we do pretty well despite that shortcoming. But I think if there's one thing to improve, I would like to see the government working harder to foster very small, high-risk companies rather than safe bet medium-sized companies. I think that's Canada is so conservative. Having lived in California, we just don't have that risk-taking culture.
Yeah. Thank you.
Great. Please join me to thank Kevin again. Really grateful to your talk and make us such an inspiring afternoon. So we look forward to connecting again after the pandemic. Hopefully we can have in-person meetings and in-person seminars.
I'd like that very much. I'm sorry not to have been able to be with you in person. Thanks all for spending your afternoon with me. I hope you have a nice weekend wherever you are.
Thank you all for attending. Have a nice rest of the day and have a nice weekend. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.